Okay, so well, it is 6 o'clock, everybody, on Thursday evening. For some of us it's not. For some of us, it's almost breakfast time. Wendy,
Mm.
it's lunchtime for you, Wendy, isn't it? So yeah, but and there's Jenny. Hi, Jenny. Long time no see. It's yeah, it's Thursday evening in very, very, very dry England. Send us some rain, please, you Americans. We need some. Anyway, so it's Thursday Garden Chat. I'm just going to sort of talk about what's coming up in the next few weeks, and then Noel is going to introduce our guest this evening. So next week we start quite an exciting new venture, really. We start a planting design course in person at Surge Hill, which is Tom Stuart Smith's home and garden, which is wonderful. And we've done courses at Tom Stuart Smith's before at the Plant Library, but we've done them as one-day events. However, this is a three-part event where it's actually a sort of educational course. So we string the days together, and people are going to do coursework and produce planting plans based on the plant library and Tom's own garden, or Tom and Sue's garden. So it's very exciting. It's a slightly new venture for us, and we're really, really happy to be doing that. Anyway, if anybody is over on this side of the Atlantic, I think most of most of you guys are on the other side of the Atlantic. Then there's time still to book for this course because it's very exciting. That's next Wednesday. And then early June, we will be back at NEP, which is very well known, much talked about. And we will be in the walled garden at NEP with the wonderful James Hitchmo and Charlie Harper, who's the head gardener. We did this last year. It was a fantastic event, learning how it was built, how it was designed, how it was constructed, how it was planted, and how it's maintained. And it is pretty gorgeous, and it is having quite a ripple effect, I have to say, in this country, because as a lot of you will probably know, NEP is a huge, wide estate with huge animals, but the walled garden is on a very nice, intimate scale. And so I think people can kind of get what's going on and use this for their own garden. So that's great. I'll mention one more live event which is coming up. We have quite a few planned this summer, so do look at our events page. But this is at Wakehurst Place, which is owned by Kew. Well, that's actually owned by the National Trust, but it's Kew Botanical Garden, Royal Botanical Gardens, and we are doing a day there, all based on trees, with Henrik Schoeman and Arit Anderson, and that is in the middle of June. That's going to be a very interesting day because a lot of it will be spent out looking at trees at Wakehurst Place. So hardly a better place to go around and look at trees. So those are some events coming up, but we do have a lot planned for this summer. So please have a look at the events page. Obviously, the Thursday Garden Chat gets recorded and goes onto our YouTube channel, where you can catch up with lots and lots of our past and previous talks. We also have a podcast channel now, which is gaining a lot of interest, and Noel and I are really enjoying that. And we are also joined by the wonderful Claire Greenslade and Richard Court as well, who help us find and interview people and supply wonderful content. So lots on offer, lots of exciting news to tell you this summer, but we won't spill the beans yet, because if we tell you everything, then we won't have anything to tell you later on. So there we go. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Noel, who is not in Portugal. Yeah, I think you're actually are you in Wales, or are you in
I'm in
Hereford?
The Welsh borders. I'm just so enjoying this wonderful spring, this incredible fresh green leaves on the trees, all the
Have they
horses.
had rain there then? Have they had some rain?
Probably
We
not
haven't.
much actually, but
No.
it's just spring.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, 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 yeah.
Chestnuts, hawthorn in flower, lilac, wisteria. It's a really, really beautiful spring. So I really
A little bit different to Portugal.
yeah. Although we're missing all the annual wildflowers, which are the big thing in Portugal at this time
You
of year.
can't have it all,
Oh, I
Noel.
have it both. No,
And there was, well, just a little bit of news. Noel and I were actually in the same place at the same time last weekend,
yes,
which is
yes,
pretty
yes,
unheard
yes,
of.
yes.
We went to the wonderful Denman's garden here in West Sussex, and did a little bit of shooting, as in films, not animals, and
Or each other.
recording. Or each other, yeah, although tempted, I have to say. Anyway, right, I'm going to pass over to Noel before I incriminate myself anymore, and to introduce tonight's guest.
Great, thank you, Annie. Thank you. So Annie and I are always looking at other people's websites all over the world. It's a great way of just seeing who's doing what in horticulture and landscape, and coming across good projects, good people, some of whom we then like to try to persuade to do stuff for us. Pacific Horticulture, which used to be a magazine and is now a sort of online portal, really, has been a particularly rich source. A lot going on in the American West Coast. And of course, it's a region with a really fantastic flora, and particularly in terms of dry climate, dry summer climate gardening, a really very innovative area. A few months ago, we had Saxon Holt, the region's veteran garden photographer, who's also put a huge amount of work and energy into helping us understand drier climate gardening. So it was in my perusing of Pacific horticulture, I came across the Potrero Hill Eco-patch, rather intriguingly named project in San Francisco, which seemed to be using or taking some of our European developed planting methodologies and applying them to California natives as part of a biodiversity project. It sounded really rather intriguing. So we thought we'd ask their chief landscape architect, who's been involved with this community project, Alex Harker, to talk about the project. But first of all, Alex, we always like to ask people how you got into the landscape and plant business.
Oh man, that's a hard one. I was saying that I grew up in Santa Cruz, which is just south of San Francisco. And Santa Cruz and all of the Santa Cruz Mountains are just really a biodiversity hotspot.
Mm,
There's so many different ecosystems and places to explore, and I have to say that was probably the main factor.
mm, mm.
Yeah.
And so you grew up with this fantastic flora, and then how did that lead into your professional work?
Oh yeah, yeah. So then I ended up getting really interested in kind of sustainability in the built environment, and so I went on to study environmental design in Boulder, Colorado, actually,
Right.
and then I came back to California to go to University of California at Berkeley for my master's in landscape architecture.
Mhm.
I also studied city planning while I was there. And I've kind of always leaned more towards the horticultural. There's a lot of different elements of landscape architecture practice that people focus on, and I've really kind of taken a deeper dive into the plants since become a arborist, and have been really grateful to find this niche.
Yeah, yeah. Good, good, great. So would you like to start your presentation and tell us about the
I
EcoPad?
would love to. So yeah, this has been really kind of a full circle moment, being invited to speak because we have been really inspired um, by what's happening in Europe. And I personally have actually been inspired by a lot of Noel's writings, and so it's just been great to be given this opportunity. So what I'm talking about today is the Eco Patch, which is basically a San Francisco native plant test garden. And so this project was done while I was working on my private practice field collective with my partner, Nikki Copley, who is currently in New Zealand and working in New Zealand. And I'm actually currently working at Mid Peninsula Regional Open Space District, which is uh, basically 70,000 plus acres of nature preserves in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So my work here with the Eco Patch kind of led to that work. And so our focus at Field Collective was really, mainstreaming the use of native plants, experimenting with new ways of practicing landscape architecture and environmental advocacy. And so one of the things that we really noticed in our practice in the landscape architecture world, and just in general being in California, was that California native plants were missing from a lot of the built environment. And a lot of that has to do with us having a summer dry climate. And so for a good portion of the year, the plants are kind of dried out, and it's not meeting people's common aesthetic expectations for what they expect to see in planting in the public realm, or even private gardens. And so uh, we were wanting to really show and empower people to use California native plants to make the argument. Our hypothesis was essentially that it has to do with people just don't know how to design with California native plants. And if we could work to create kind of a compelling argument that they are beautiful, that they would be used more widely. And one of the solutions that we looked towards was European examples of these mixed perennial plantings, where they're tested and researched by institutions, they're developed, and then they're made readily available to the public. And if anyone has better pictures of of some of these mixes, I would gladly take them. Um, and so we really wanted to see if we could experiment with developing these mixes, and if that would be a way that we can make a compelling argument and make to use California native plants and make them more accessible. And so an opportunity presented itself when a neighborhood group in Potrero Hill of San Francisco reached out to us, and they were wanting to do a native San Francisco plant demonstration garden. Um, and some of the people involved were California Native Plant Society folks, and so they were they were very specific about not just using California native plants, but using San Francisco native plants. And so that really provided actually a pretty interesting constraint for the project. And so the location is actually, this is obviously next to a freeway, and is owned by Caltrans, which is kind of the government agency that runs freeways. And so we had to work with them to be able to do planting. So as I said, the criteria were plants native to San Francisco. We have a big focus on biodiversity and providing habitat and food. That's a really big motivator for planting native plants for us. And as I mentioned, it was really important that we make it visually compelling, because otherwise people weren't going to recreate it. So the size of the garden, we started with a 900 square foot test garden. What they initially wanted was a full scale whole hillside demonstration garden, but due to budget and other reasons, we were able to kind of hone in on this smaller area, and that also served our purpose of being able to develop these mixes. So another really interesting thing about this site is we have kind of through the Bay Area this serpentine bedrock, which is this really unique geologic condition, which is relatively rare. You can see the blue indicates where it is in San Francisco. Some of it is in the Presidio, but there's some really, it's kind of a harsh soil to grow in. And so there's some really specifically adapted plants, and then also wildlife for those plants in these specific areas that evolved for this serpentine habitat. Another element that influenced our plant selection is you can see that a lot of San Francisco Bay is actually fill, and so a lot of the plants were perhaps more coastal, because we were trying to be in keeping with what may have been there initially. So these are just some of specifically the butterflies that depend on serpentine habitat for their survival. And because of the habitat fragmentation, um, they're endangered, such as the mission blue butterfly, which relies on the silver lupin, which grows in serpentine soils. Also, the bay checker spot butterfly, which is endangered, which relies on the dot seed plantain, which more or less only grows in serpentine soils. So some real specialized plants and insects. And so, as I mentioned, habitat fragmentation was a big part of the reason why these are threatened and endangered. And so, this was another example of, if we can get people to plant these plants, we're actually creating habitat corridors to reduce the amount of fragmentation, which is how we led to calling this the eco-patch, because there's the idea of, there's a bunch of isolated patches, but as you aggregate the isolated patches, you start to um, form corridors. And we were also really inspired by the work of Doug Tallamy, and his idea of the homegrown national park, if you're familiar with his work, and really utilizing all of this space that we have, um, just in our everyday environments. So we utilized three main design strategies. We worked with being inspired by native plant communities. And I really emphasize that this is not a restoration project. When we create these design plant communities, we're just really evoking those. We looked at seasonal charting for that seasonal interest element, and we looked at layering the plants. So this is around Monterey Bay, Pacific Grove, which is just south of where I grew up in Santa Cruz. And so this is the seaside woolly sunflower, and you'll see that making a cameo later on. And so while we're evoking these plant communities, but not being literal, we're still very much creating something that is ecologically functional. So that was important to us. So this is an example of how we started the process, where we created our archetype, in this instance, oak understory. We created just kind of a description of the landscape inspiration and the design response that we wanted to test. And so this was really helpful to have the written exercise to test our design against, as a framework to go back to for our design work, and to guide our design decisions. And just looking at some plants that could potentially be in the area. Then we developed this seasonal charting, and this is one of the places where we really look towards Noel's work and his writings with Pete Odolph, and thinking really creatively about seasonality and not just flowering. We did look at seasonal blooming, just because that was an important ecological functioning to create kind of year-round nectar and feeding sources. So this is an example from our oak savanna mix. The third strategy was layering, and for this we were really inspired by Thomas Rainier and Claudia West's book, Planting for a Post-Wild World. I'm not sure if folks are familiar with that, but it's a great book. And so we experimented a lot with the percentages that they talked about in their book, and creating a structural layer that's the backbone, a seasonal layer that are seasonally visually dominant, a filler species, which is generally kind of an annual that can reseed itself to fill in interstitial space while the other plants are getting established. And then ground covers, which encompass almost half of the planting. And this was especially important, we felt, for these landscapes in California to have, if we did nothing else, to establish what could be used as a relatively evergreen ground cover planting that would keep things looking tidy and interesting year round, while all of this structural and seasonal things were going around above it. And so those plants we really wanted to be rhizominous and spreading, stress tolerant. And so taking all of those 3 things into account, we developed 8 plant study areas, which were essentially squares that we then rotated to create a garden, with the idea that you could use it to fill any amount of space. And so I think it's funny that Saxon presented before me, because I have some of his photographs in my presentation. And so this is one of his photographs. So this is looking at some of the plant mix plots. And we really kind of anchored all of the plots around this existing coast live oak tree, which is a really important ecologically functioning plant for us in the Bay Area. So for the coastal dune scrub mix, which was the first mix, we were looking at kind of areas of scrub are a really common sort of plant community around the Bay Area. So this was kind of a coastal scrub community. And so for this, we tested using a beach strawberry as a ground cover, which spreads by rhizomes. And it was pretty successful in that regard. And we used it in 2 different mixes, and it was able to suppress a lot of weeds. It was in this mix that we had the silver lupin, which, if you recall, was important for habitat for the mission blue butterfly. Coast buckwheat was a structural plant, and we have the seaside woolly sunflower. It's not flowering, but it's in the background. So this is the same mix, but in June. So you can see how it's changed. The California sea pink, the flower heads are more or less dried out at this point. Seaside woolly sunflower blooming. And then this is the same mix in May. So just to give you a sense of the dynamic nature of the mix. The next one was the beach strawberry coastal prairie. And again, these are not recreations of landscapes. These are evocative of these native plant communities. So for this one, we also use the beach strawberry as a ground cover layer. And you can see here we have Pacific reed grass is really the structural element in this mix. And we did use a lot of bunch grasses for that structural element. And we focused a lot on grass-based mixes because in California, losing grasslands is a huge issue. And there used to be a lot of grasslands, and the number has reduced a lot, and it's something that we're trying to bring back. So in this mix, one of the seasonal plants was Phacelia, which was something that pollinators went crazy for. It really created dramatic seasonal interest. Another plant that was a seasonal plant here was the Iris douglassiana, which is the Douglas iris. You can see it's these purple flowers right there. Again, the Phacelia. The Phacelia also supports the mission blue butterfly. And here I just love how you can see the strawberry, the beach strawberry, really blanketing the ground. The next was the fescue coastal prairie mix. And so for this, we used a different ground cover. This is a California pony's foot, which I really love because it's a really fine grain ground cover. You can see here kind of up close. And then the other ground cover plant that we tried to get established here was yarrow, which we had kind of mixed success with the yarrow in this location. But we definitely had success with the California's ponyfoot. And this is just an aerial view of that. You can see the seasonal interest of the Douglas iris, and then the structural bunch grasses, and then also the structural June sagewort. This is the mix in early May, a couple years after planting. And you can see in the lower corner, we had tags with codes so that people could actually know what plants they were looking at and learn more about it. It would go to the California Native Plant Society website where people could even see which nurseries they could get these plants at. And then here's the garden in late June, and you can see the seasonal change. I think a lot of people think California is the Golden State because of the gold rush, but really, I think it's because all of the grasses turn golden tan at a certain point in the summer, and you've just got these rolling hillsides of this color of the tan grasses. And I like this mix because the Dune sagewort really provides a contrast against the grasses. Skippers really love this mix. We had a Lepidopterist visit the site, and he talked a lot about how the skipper uses it as part of their life cycle, the grasses specifically. Coyote bush scrub, this is another really predominant landscape plant community that we have in California. It's unfortunately very flammable. And it's kind of what happens between a grassland and a forest. So a lot of times when a grassland eventually becomes a scrub mix. And so for this, we used a prostrate coyote bush as the ground cover, and I have an image of that. And then some things that were a lot more seasonal. We have sticky monkey flower, which is the orange in the background, and a deerweed, which is in the foreground. So this is earlier on in the planting process, a prostrate coyote bush. And the garden attracted a lot of butterflies and insects that weren't necessarily the native ones that we were catering towards, but our real goal was increasing biodiversity, and so we really welcomed anything that found our garden to be a good place for feed. One of my absolutely favorite plants that I discovered while working on this project was the nude buckwheat. It's just really ethereal looking, and then it has these inflorescences where I think this is late June, and this is in late July, where it just turns this rust color. And according to the lepidopterist that visited the site, this actually still provides nectaring. He's still seen butterflies nectaring even when the flowers have dried out to this extent. So it's still providing ecological value. For the coyote bush scrub, we really found that this was an example of, because of the small scale that we developed the plant mixes, it didn't really lend itself to planting communities that really needed to be on a larger scale. So one of the plants we had here was Ceanothus, and it really kind of dominated the small scale of the planting. So that's one I would like to try again at some point, just at a larger scale. And here again, we have the leafless iris as a seasonal interest plant. Oak understory. So for this one, we used yerba buena. And I'm not sure if you have this in Europe, but San Francisco actually used to be called yerba buena because it was blanketed in this brown cover. And I understand why, because it did very well in this garden, and it's absolutely something that I would use again. And this particular mix we situated right under the existing oak tree. This is just showing the yerba buena, just really blanketing the ground. And then another plant I really loved in this was the ribes, which just had broader leaves. It was just a lighter green color. It provided a lot of contrast. And then this is later in the summer where things are starting to dry out, but we have the hummingbird sage, which is really providing a lot of form and visual interest. Oak savanna. Here we used a carex as the ground cover planting. So this is the mix in February. You can see we have a thistle. This is a coyote mint. And then this is the same mix in May. Here you can see the cobwebby thistle in the foreground. And then this is the same mix in late June, once everything's very dried out. But at least in my mind, I find this compelling. I find all of those seasons interesting. I think this is a mix that I would definitely use again. So here we had mixed success with the filler species in terms of it growing and then also it reseeding. So this Dune Gilia was one thing that worked really well, in that it came up and it actually reseeded itself. Here's the coyote mint in the foreground. And so this is in May. Later on in the summer, the coyote mint would flower, providing seasonal interest. And then further along, late July, everything's drying out. We have the dried flower heads of the coyote mint. And then even further on in the summer, we had ethereal spear, which is the only bulb that we used in any of these mixes. And I really love this one. It's really brief, so it's definitely a seasonal plant. I think it had a window of maybe a week or two of flowering, but when it was flowering, it was really beautiful. And then the serpentine meadow, and this is really the one that was the heavy hitter with a lot of the really endemic serpentine adapted plants. And so it was largely a grass-based mixed, a meadow. It had the dot seed plantain, the Plantago erecta, which was the one that supported the bay checker spot butterfly. It also had the Franciscan wallflower, which I have an image of flowering later on, which supports the San Bruno elfin butterfly, which is also an endangered butterfly. And so I want to take a moment to point out that the California Native Plant Society also felt very strongly that we do local ecotype planting. And so we worked really hard to get plants that were collected from native populations as close as possible to the site. And so this is a sampling of where these plants came from. And the majority, 309 of the plants that we used came from the San Bruno Mountains, which are basically a few miles south of our site. So this is really hyper local, and in particular, the serpentine adapted plants, because San Bruno Mountain had that same serpentine habitat. And so here is the Franciscan wallflower, which supports the San Bruno elfin butterfly. And so this came um, from specifically the nursery on San Bruno Mountain, which collected it in a way that didn't impact its native populations because this plant itself is endangered. And then this is the dot seed plantain, which is what the bay checker spot butterfly relies on as its host plant. And you can see it's a small plant. And so it's very delicate. But it was a really important part of this plant mix because of its habitat value. And then Ruby Chalice clarkia. This was a great example of an annual reseeding pillar plant. This is in late June. It tends to pop up when everything else is starting to turn the tan color. And then because we use these California native bunch grasses as essentially the framework for the mix, they provided structural interest throughout, even as they changed from greens to tans to golden. They really held the space. And so this is a sketch from another landscape architecture practice, surface design. And I mentioned that this was a test garden and that the ultimate goal was to have a larger scale demonstration garden. And so this is the next evolution of the garden. And it's a little bit hard because we ended up losing a lot of those initial plots we had, but also with the understanding that our test garden was always a means to an end, and that this more permanent form provided more places for people to gather to learn about the plants. So a framework that was more about people going into the space. And so this is an image of a pathway that's kind of been carved through the garden. I love this because you can see downtown San Francisco in the background and you get a sense of the context. And then these are the mixes. This was, I think, last year. Yeah, last year. And how the pathways are starting to cut through it. It's an interesting evolution. And that's it. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to come out of screen share, Alex?
Yeah.
Thank you. And we can invite people to ask questions. One question I have to kick off with is what kind of a response did you get from the general public on the planting, and you know what was the general consensus from everybody?
Yeah, I feel like verdict was still out for some people.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people there was one garden group that really still wasn't convinced. I definitely found a lot more people enthusiastic that were in the plant world.
Yeah.
So there's that. But we were able to use it probably most successfully because then we had a lot of clients. Our clients generally sought us out because of the specialty of using native plants and plant communities.
Mm-hmm.
And it provided great examples to show them to get buy-in, because otherwise people are hesitant to spend a lot of money on something that's kind of experimental. So it's really useful in that regard.
Yeah, yeah. And what about ongoing kind of maintenance in terms of, I mean, they're not conventional gardens as such, but you know, you do need maintenance. How did you approach that?
Yeah, so we really wanted to create something, you know, if this is something we want just to be in the public and accessible, we focused on having something where you could cut it back once a year
Mm-hmm.
as the primary means of maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
So not a lot of, you know, there was some weeding. It's hard to avoid that completely, but we did we did have a lot of success with the ground covers, kind of dealing with some of the weeds, but really the cutting things down, which was important. We were really inspired by I'm blanking on her name, but she wrote Joan Nausser, I think.
Oh, Joe Nassauer at in
Yeah.
Ann Arbor, isn't she?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
Joe
she wrote a
Nassauer.
part.
Joe Nassauer.
Yeah. Messy ecosystems, orderly frames.
That's nice.
Yeah, no, I think she, she's really addressed that whole issue of public acceptance and how people read landscapes and how important it is that you actually make plantings and landscapes that people like, because that then gives it political acceptance. And obviously this is quite an issue in the States, where you still have this ridiculous business over mowing front lawns and all of that.
Yeah.
But I think I saw a presentation she did where she was it was actually in Portugal, but she was zoomed in, and I sort of felt she was perhaps not kind of quite keeping up, because there's been, since I last heard her speak, which was quite a long time ago, there's been so much evolution in the States, so much more interest in native plants, and I just felt she was kind of holding back a bit and being perhaps a little bit too tidy. But I suppose an awful lot does depend on the state and the region and different sort of cultural expectations of public planting.
Absolutely. Yeah, so often here we're trying to recreate English estates
Yeah.
with our front lawns. But yeah, her writings, when she talked about cues to care, being able to see that the human hand is present in landscapes, and even a small gesture like cutting stuff back once a year, I felt did a lot to show that there was that care. Also, just keeping the plants just kind of more compact. And so I would say that's the primary thing. We really tried to be as hands off as possible, while still showing that there was
Yeah,
some.
yeah. I mean, I think it's what I was going to ask you was that there's probably was a tension between choosing plants for ecological functionality and the fact that they're the key components of an ecosystem, but on the other hand, some of those may not be particularly attractive, and on the other hand, you've got these other species that are perhaps less important, but have that kind of public wow factor, and that's always a very difficult one to get the balance right, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the plantago, was the plantain was a big example of that, where
Yeah,
basically you're looking at, you don't even see it.
yeah.
But it's arguably one of the most important plants out of all of those that we worked with.
Important in what way? Forming a matrix, or
Because
well,
it's the host plant for the bay checker spot butterfly. It's
right,
basically
yeah,
the only host plant, and that's
yeah.
one of the ones that only grows in serpentine.
Mm.
Um, so yeah.
Alex, are you aware, did any schools use this? Did they take kids out to see it and talk about it? Is it, is there any, was there any sort of involvement in educating children's groups, anything like that?
Yeah, children specifically, not as much. We did do a lot of outreach, and one thing that's not really shown in my presentation, because I didn't feel that there was time, but like, this was done by volunteers, all of and I felt that led, I mean, that in itself is is really significant, because then people are going to remember these plants. They have a personal relationship with these plants when they're working with them. And so that was a big part of the people being able to learn from it. We did lead tours. It was generally adults. I think I have a 6-year-old daughter, and Nikki, my colleague, has a 6-year-old son. And so this happened as they were growing up, and
Yeah.
they were 2 years or so. So, but not larger groups.
Yeah.
One big
Yeah.
factor was the fact that there was a freeway right there.
Yeah. Right. Right. Okay. Okay. And you mentioned your partner's working in New Zealand at the moment. What is she doing over there? Is it similar work, or and whereabouts?
Yeah, so she just moved back to Christchurch
Mm-hmm.
from there initially, and she started at a private landscape architecture practice recently. And so I
Yeah.
think continuing more with, not California native plants,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but New Zealand potentially, and working in a residential context. And it's interesting because I went the other direction where now I'm working with larger nature preserves where we
Mm-hmm.
have existing serpentine meadows that we're preserving, protecting,
Mm-hmm.
trying to get the public to engage with.
Interesting, yeah, because I mean, there's such a big emphasis on native planting in New Zealand. Really, really a huge drive. So she is a native New Zealander. That's why she's gone back there. Okay, yeah, okay, yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Good. So, what does the future hold then? What's next?
For the Eco-patch, I stopped screen sharing, but I mean, the idea is that they'll start creating these plant communities on a larger scale.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll have a larger area that's a designed oak
Mm-hmm.
woodland, using oak woodland plants underneath it, have areas cleared that are grassland, using some of the grass mixes.
Mm-hmm.
So really just implementing these plants on a larger scale, which will be interesting to see
Yeah.
because we're limited in only having those small spaces.
Yeah, yeah. And then for you personally in your work, what's next on the drawing board for you?
Yeah, well, working at Mid Peninsula Regional Open Space District,
Mm-hmm.
it's wonderful. For work next week, we're going on a wildflower walk. I'm just learning so much because we have all of these biologists on staff. So honestly, right now, I'm just taking in more information,
Yeah.
and then trying to figure out how we make that accessible
Mm-hmm.
public.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
get them excited about it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, very
Um,
exciting.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was on the Pacific horticulture jury for a design competition, and it was really interesting seeing the range of these were mostly almost entirely private gardens that were being put forward. I mean, up and down the West Coast, but I mean, mostly California. And it seemed so much that the message about being sustainable, drought tolerant, and using natives had swept the board. But I mean, I suppose that was probably quite a self-selecting range of gardens. And I just wonder how much that message has sort of penetrated a wider and more mass gardening community in terms of what you would be able to buy from a neighborhood garden center, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, there is that thing where you need to have a demand for the
Yeah.
nurseries
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
in the first place. And I think right now we were really specific about plants, and so they were harder to find. But I think increasingly more standard nurseries will have a California native plant section, and there's, some standbys that people use. But I feel like it's really something that a lot of um, landscape architects and garden designers are working towards. I don't think it's quite as niche as it
Mhm.
was even 5 years ago,
Good,
uh,
good, good. Yeah.
and also in universities. So I know I've talked to a few classes, and like there's a wave coming.
Yeah, yeah. Great,
Pretty
great, great.
fast.
We've got some messages from Jenny Harris, who's up in Washington.
Yeah.
Such a beautiful thing. I feel like I've just met my long lost sister. And I'm so personally thrilled because of doing something similar to Eco-patch up here in Washington. And I was born on a ranch that's now a mid-pen open space. Yeah.
Oh, really? That's amazing. Yeah, there's a lot of grazing lands that we've been taking over. It's
Ah,
exciting. We we have a whole grazing program, which that in itself, you know,
Oh, that sounds it. Yeah.
maintaining grasslands through
Yes. Yeah.
grazing programs.
Oh gosh, yeah, interesting. Yeah. And this whole thing of grazing, I've just spent yesterday with a colleague looking at a project here in England where it used to be totally overgrazed with sheep, or woolly maggots, as we're beginning to call them, and just
no, please.
well, you eat the things, I don't. But just reducing the grazing to just very strategic times of year just makes all the difference. I mean, the explosion in biodiversity from just that limitation was really interesting. Stephen Medley saying, "What an excellent session! It's lovely seeing all that detail of the planting mixes."
Yeah, and lovely photographs, gorgeous photographs.
Yes.
Are they your photographs, Alex?
Mostly mine.
Yeah, really good, really sort of close up, you know, very nice, very evocative. Yeah, fantastic. Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been
Great. Yeah.
really nice to be back on the West Coast, even though virtually, not really. and nice to see familiar faces like you, Jenny. It's nice to see you again and see people. So yeah, it's great. So well, good luck with your work, and hopefully we can do something about a future project, and you know, it'd be lovely to have you back and talk about that. Would be really nice.
Absolutely. And please, if you're in the Bay Area, come to Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space Preserves. They're magical places.
Oh, just got a chat in from Margot Martin to say, just finished a webinar on how the city of Toronto, Canada, is using goat grazing to control invasives.
There we go.
Goats.
Goats up and down Yonge Street in Toronto. Yeah, I've yet to see that. Wonderful. Oh no, that's great.
Thank you so much, Alex.
Yeah, lovely. Have a great day, and thanks everybody for joining, and hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye-bye. Bye.